Fantasy football. T5 League Yearly Review.
Alright, so today we're covering the 12th matchup of our WR1 Elimination Bracket Challenge. Now, in this matchup, we have Zay Flowers of the Baltimore Ravens going up against Adam Thielen of the Carolina Panthers. This one, on paper, we have two primary slot receivers that happen to be WR1s, or the most targeted players on their team, going at it. There is an asterisk when we discuss Theilen as to whether or not he is the true number one on that offense, with Xavier Legette coming out and performing at what I thought was probably expectation last year, but only time will tell if he takes the reins this year or the following. So the first thing that we like to do is let's review the offseason moves that each team has made up to this point so we can get a better understanding of what impact is this going to have on Zay Flowers potentially and what impact that means for Adam Thielen. So we'll start with the Ravens, and the Ravens offseason moves so far include signing wide receiver Theilen Wallace to a one-year deal, wide receiver DeAndre Hopkins to a one-year deal, re-signing fullback Patrick Ricard, re-signing offensive tackle Ronnie Stanley to a 3-year deal, and re-signing offensive guard Ben Cleveland. They also signed a backup quarterback Cooper Rush for Lamar Jackson. Not that that should have any impact, hopefully, for the Ravens next year. So we're not really expecting any of these off-season moves to impact Zay Flowers' production. The signing of Hopkins actually should provide more opportunities for Zay Flowers out of the slot, as Hopkins will be a threat outside of the numbers. Hopefully that will shift some of the defensive coverages to allow Flowers and the tight ends to work the middle of the field. So when we shift over to the Carolina Panthers, they've had a lot of offseason action, but it's primarily been in the form of defensive signings. There are a few offensive signings that we should consider, and those will include the signing of tight end Tommy Tremble to a 2-year deal. They signed running back Rico Dowdle to a 1-year deal. They re-signed wide receiver David Moore to a 1-year deal. They re-signed offensive tackle Brady Christensen to a 1-year deal. And they re-signed center Austin Corbett to a 1-year deal. Tremble is expected to start at tight end, and Corbett is expected to start at center for the team, unless they do something in the draft that would cause a change. Now, when it comes to speculating what moves the Carolina Panthers will make during the 2025 draft, we see a lot of mixed results. A lot of the mock drafts have them targeting or primarily focusing on defense. It goes from cornerbacks as a first-round pick or defensive linemen. One name that comes up often here is Arizona wide receiver Tator McMillan. Now, that would actually really bolster that offense and give Bryce Young another target. Does that change Thielen's productivity potentially? Of course it does. McMillan will immediately come in, if drafted, and be a day one impact, so the targets are going to have to come away from somebody. When we shift over to the Ravens and we review some of the mock drafts out there, we see that there's a heavy focus on defense as well in the first 3 rounds. The acquisition of DeAndre Hopkins during the offseason did address a much needed possession receiver to help outside the numbers. And as we already mentioned, that should only provide Zay Flowers with more opportunities for the middle of the field. Now, that might not come in the form of like huge plays, but targets, receptions, and then, of course, it would be unlikely that he wouldn't achieve the same type of yardage, at least based off of his prior year performance. Review some of the mock drafts out there. We will see that they are also heavily focused in the first 3 rounds on acquiring additional defensive pieces. Rashad Bateman most likely will line up on the left side, Hopkins on the right side, which will allow Zay Flowers in the position that he loves most, that being the slot, to work the middle of the field. Now, what this would mean for Zay potentially is that he's going to see more favorable matchups and opportunities out of the slot, which might not come in the form of 20-plus yard plays, but a ton of first downs, a ton of receptions, a ton of targets. Huge for us fantasy owners. All right, so we've recapped some of the offseason moves for each of the teams. There's not much impact to either of these receivers to this point that we're concerned about. When it comes to reviewing the mock drafts, Carolina's first-round pick could be impactful for Adam Thielen's stock, so we'll have to monitor that closely. But for now, we're going to go ahead and jump into the one-on-one matchup when we do the stat comparison between Thielen and Zay Flowers. So fantasy-wise, it was not a good year for Adam Thielen. He missed a lot of the weeks between week 4 and week 11. On the season, he had a total of 4 bust weeks and 2 boom weeks, and he earned 52 in the player rankings at the wide receiver position. Funny enough, his best weeks in fantasy came against Tampa Bay Buccaneers, specifically week 17, where he had 5 receptions for 110 yards, 2 touchdowns on 6 targets, so a high efficiency game for him. When we shift over to Zay Flowers had 6 bust weeks and 3 boom weeks. He earned a player ranking of 25th, which he ended up becoming, he is a Pro Bowl receiver, which surprised a lot of people. When we dive into his actual production, we will see his best week came in week 9 fantasy-wise, where he had 5 receptions for 127 yards and 2 touchdowns on 6 targets. So an extremely efficient game for him there. So we're comparing age versus youth here. We see that Theilen had a hard time staying on the field and healthy, which really impacted his ranking and total fantasy output. While on the other hand, Flowers took advantage in certain weeks, but then there were other weeks that it doesn't really appear that he kind of showed up. So there's something to do with the matchups and how the defenses were able to contain him. We'll have to find out if the acquisition of Hopkins opens that up. So now let's jump into the season totals. For Adam Thielen, he had 48 receptions for 615 yards, 5 touchdowns on 62 targets. So very efficient. If he was on the field and was healthy, he most likely would have gotten a lot more points than the 140 that he ended up with on the year. And a lot of that has to do with injury. When we shift over to Zay Flowers, Flowers had 74 receptions on the year for 1,059 yards, 4 touchdowns on 116 targets. Flowers is used a little more in the run game. He did have 9 carries for 56 yards, but 0 touchdowns. And he did finish with 210 fantasy points on the year. Now, as we discussed earlier, there's a little bit of speculation as to how Zay Flowers got a Pro Bowl nod based off of that stat line alone. I think because him and Rashad Bateman were the primary targets for Lamar Jackson's offense outside of Mark Andrews, there might have been, and they performed so well, a lot of that might have influenced the decision. When we consider what that means for this upcoming year, I think Flowers' ceiling can only raise. He'll probably get more opportunities with the arrival like we discussed. Thielen, on the other hand, he's working on borrowed time. If they bring in another offensive weapon during the draft, it's going to have to eat into somebody's production, and I'm not sure if Leggett is the one that we're going to see targets diminish from. I could definitely imagine Thielen turning into a very important role player out of the slot for the offense, and he'll primarily be targeted for third down conversions, as well as whenever they're in the red zone and they're trying to get that touchdown. So based off of all this information and what we're speculating in the offseason moves in our mock drafts, we are going to give Zay Flowers the nod over Adam Thielen. So congratulations, Zay Flowers. Adam Thielen, if you don't make it to the second round, you are out of here. So now that Zay Flowers is in the second round, we'll be covering the 12th matchup. So there's only 4 remaining before we'll move into our 2 matchup round 2 breakdowns, because we'll have already covered all the stats there. If you disagree, no problem. Feel free to leave a comment as to who you would have selected or why you would have selected Thielen over Flowers. And then hopefully we'll see you in the next one.
Thank you.